The 10 Primitive Persecutions of the Early Christians, taken from John Foxe's Book of Martyrs. The first persecution under Nero, AD 67. The first persecution of the Church took place in the year 67, under Nero, the 6th Emperor of Rome. This monarch reigned for the space of 5 years, with tolerable credit to himself, but then gave way to the greatest extravagancy of temper, and to the most atrocious barbarities. Among other diabolical whims, he ordered that the city of Rome should be set on fire, which order was executed by his officers, guards, and servants. While the imperial city was in flames, he went up to the tower of Mycenaeus, played upon his harp, and sung the song of the burning of Troy, openly declared that he wished to ruin all things before his death. Besides the noble pile called the circus, many other palaces and houses were consumed. Several thousands perished in the flames, were smothered in the smoke, or buried beneath the ruins. This dreadful conflagration continued for 9 days, when Nero, finding that his conduct was greatly blamed, and severe odium cast upon him, determined to lay the whole upon the Christians, at once to excuse himself, and have an opportunity of glutting his sight with new cruelties. This was the occasion of the first persecution, under the barbarities exercised on the Christians, were such as even excited the commiseration of the Romans themselves. Nero even refined upon cruelty, and contrived all manner of punishments for the Christians that the most infernal imagination could design. In particular, he had some sewed up in the skins of wild beasts, and then worried by dogs until they expired, and others, dressed in shirts made with stiff wax, fixed to axle trees, and set on fire in his gardens in order to illuminate them. This persecution was general throughout the whole Roman Empire, but it rather increased than diminished the spirit of Christianity. In the course of it, St. Paul and St. Peter were martyred. To their names may be added Erastus, Chamberlain of Corinth, Aristarchus the Macedonian, and Trophimus, an Ephesian converted by St. Paul, and fellow laborer with him Joseph, commonly called Barsabas, and Ananias, Bishop of Damascus, each of the 70. The second persecution under Domitian, AD 81. The Emperor Domitian, who was naturally inclined to cruelty, first slew his brother, and then raised the second persecution against the Christians. In his rage, he put to death some of the Roman senators, some through malice, and others to confiscate their estates. He then commanded all the lineage of David to be put to death. Among the numerous martyrs that suffered during the persecution was Simeon, the Bishop of Jerusalem, who was crucified, and St. John, who was boiled in oil, and afterwards banished to Patmos. Flavia, the daughter of a Roman senator, was likewise banished to Pontus, and a law was made that no Christian, once brought before the tribunal, should be exempted from punishment without renouncing his religion. A variety of fabricated tales were, during this reign, composed in order to injure the Christians. Such was the infatuation of the pagans that if famine, pestilence, or earthquakes inflicted any of the Roman provinces, it was laid upon the Christians. These persecutions among the Christians increased the number of informers, and many, for the sake of gain, swore away the lives of the innocent. Another hardship was that, when any Christians were brought before the magistrates, a test of oath was proposed, when, if they refused to take it, death was pronounced against them, and if they confessed themselves Christians, the sentence was the same. The following were the most remarkable among the numerous martyrs who suffered during this persecution. Dionysius, the Areopagite, was an Athenian by birth, and educated in all the useful and ornamental literature of Greece. He then travelled to Egypt to study astronomy, and made very particular observations on the great and supernatural eclipse, which happened at the time of our Saviour's crucifixion. The sanctity of his conversion and the purity of his manners recommended him so strongly to Christians in general that he was appointed Bishop of Athens. Nicomedus, a benevolent Christian of some distinction, suffered at Rome during the rage of Domitian's persecution. Protasius and Gervasius were martyred at Milan. Timothy was celebrated, the disciple of St. Paul and Bishop of Ephesus, where he zealously governed the church till AD 97. At this period, as the pagans were about to celebrate a feast called Kategogion, Timothy, meeting the procession, severely reproved them for their ridiculous idolatry, which so exasperated the people that they fell upon him with their clubs, and beat him in so dreadful a manner that he expired of the bruises only 2 days later. The third persecution under Trajan, AD 108. Nerva, succeeding Domitian, gave a respite to the sufferings of the Christians, but reigning only 13 months, his successor, Trajan, in the 10th year of his reign, AD 108, began the third persecution against the Christians. While the persecution raged, Pliny, a heathen philosopher, wrote to the emperor in favor of the Christians, to whose epistle Trajan returned this indecisive answer: the Christians ought not to be sought after, but when brought before the magistracy, should be punished. Trajan, however, soon after wrote to Jerusalem, and gave orders to his officers to exterminate the stock of David, in consequence of which all that could be found of that race were put to death. Symphorosa, a widow, and her 7 sons were commanded by the emperor to sacrifice to the heathen deities. She was carried to the temple of Hercules, scourged, and hung up for some time by the hair of her head. Then, being taken down, a large stone was fastened to her neck, and she was thrown into the river, where she expired. With respect to the sons, they were fastened to 7 posts, and being drawn up by pulleys, their limbs were dislocated. These tortures not affecting their resolution, they were martyred by stabbing. except for Eugenius the youngest, who was sawed asunder. Phocas, the bishop of Pontus, refusing to sacrifice to Neptune, was, by the immediate order of Trajan, cast first into a hot lime kiln, and then thrown into a scalding bath until he expired. Trajan likewise commanded the martyrdom of Ignatius, the bishop of Antioch. This holy man was the person whom, when an infant, Christ took into his very arms and showed to his disciples, as one that would be a pattern of humility and innocence. He received the gospel afterward from St. John the Evangelist, and was exceedingly zealous in his mission. He boldly vindicated the faith of Christ before the emperor, for which he was cast into prison and tormented in a most cruel manner. After being dreadfully scourged, he was compelled to hold fire in his hands, and at the same time papers clipped in oil were put to his sides and set on fire. His flesh was then torn with red-hot pincers, and at last he was dispatched by being torn to pieces by wild beasts. Trajan being succeeded by Adrian, the latter continued his third persecution with as much severity as his predecessor. About this time, Alexander, bishop of Rome, with his 2 deacons, were martyred, as were Quirinus and Hernes, with their families, Zenon, a Roman nobleman, and about 10,000 other Christians. In Mount Ararat, many were crucified, crowned with thorns, and spears ran into their sides, in imitation of Christ's passion. Eustachius, a brave and successful Roman commander, was, by the order of the emperor, ordered to join in an idolatrous sacrifice to celebrate some of his own victories, but his faith, being a Christian in his heart, was so much greater than his vanity that he nobly refused it. Enraged at the denial, the ungrateful emperor forgot the service of his skillful commander and ordered him and his whole family to be martyred. At the martyrdom of Faustinus and Jovita, brothers and citizens of Brescia, their torments were so many and their patience so great that Calocarius, a pagan, beholding them, was struck with admiration, and exclaimed in a kind of ecstasy, "Great is the God of the Christians," for which he was apprehended, and suffered a similar fate. Many other similar cruelties and rigors were exercised against the Christians, until Quadratus, the bishop of Athens, made a learned apology in their favor before the emperor, who happened to be there, and Aristides, a philosopher of the same city, wrote an elegant epistle, which caused Adrian to relax in his severities and relent in their favor. Adrian, dying in AD 138, was succeeded by Antoninus Pius, one of the most amiable monarchs that ever reigned, and who stayed the persecution against the Christians. The fourth persecution, under Marcus Aurelius Antoninus, AD 162. This commenced AD 162 under Marcus Aurelius Antoninus Philosophus, a strong pagan. The cruelties used in his prosecution were such that many of the spectators shuddered with horror at the sight, and were astonished at the intrepidity of the sufferers. Some of the martyrs were obliged to pass, with their already wounded feet, over thorns, nails, sharp shells, and upon their points, Others were scourged till their sinews and veins laid bare, and after suffering the most excruciating tortures that could be devised, they were destroyed by the most terrible deaths. Germanicus, a young man, but a true Christian, being delivered to the wild beasts on account of his faith, behaved with such an astonishing courage that several pagan converts to a faith which inspired such fortitude. Polycarp, the venerable bishop of Smyrna, hearing that persons were seeking for him, escaped, but was discovered by a child. After feasting the guards with whom apprehended him, he desired an hour in prayer, which being allowed, he prayed with such fervency that his guards repented that they had been instrumental in taking him. He was, however, carried before the proconsul, condemned, and burned in the marketplace. 12 other Christians who had been friendly with Polycarp were soon after martyred. The circumstances attending the execution of this venerable old man, as they were of no common nature, so it would be injurious to credit our professed history of martyrdom to pass them over in silence. It was observed by the spectators that after finishing his prayer at the stake, to which he was only tied, but not nailed as usual, as he assured them he would stand immovable, the flames on their kindling the faggots encircled his body like an arch without touching him, and the executioner, on seeing this, was ordered to pierce him with a sword, when so great a quantity of blood flowed out as extinguished the fire. But his body, at the instigation of the enemies of the Gospels, especially Jews, was ordered to be consumed in the pile, and the request of his friends, who wished to give it a Christian burial, rejected. They nevertheless collected his bones, and as much of his remains as possible, and caused them to be decently interred. Metrodorus, a minister, who preached boldly, and Paeonius, who made some excellent apologies for the Christian faith, were likewise burnt. Carpus and Papillus, 2 worthy Christians, and Agathonica, a pious woman, suffered martyrdom at Pergamopolis in Asia. Felicitatus, an illustrious Roman lady of a considerable family, and the most shining virtues, was a devout Christian too. She had 7 sons, whom she had educated with the most exemplary piety. Janorius, the eldest, was scourged and pressed to death with weights. Felix and Philip, the 2 next, had their brains dashed out with clubs. Silvanus, the 4th, was murdered by being thrown from a precipice, and 3 younger sons, Alexander, Vitalis, and Martial, were beheaded. The mother was beheaded with the same sword as the 3 latter. Justin, the celebrated philosopher, fell a martyr in this persecution. He was a native of Neapolis in Samaria, and was born AD 103. Justin was a great lover of truth and a universal scholar. He investigated the Stoic and Peripatetic philosophy, and attempted the Pythagorean, but the behavior of one of its professors disgusting him, he applied himself to the Platonic, in which he took great delight. About the year 133, when he was 30 years of age, he became a convert to Christianity, and then, for the first time, perceived the real nature of truth. he wrote an elegant epistle to the Gentiles, and employed his talents in convincing the Jews of the truth of the Christian rites, spending a great deal of time travelling, till he took up his abode in Rome, and fixed his habitation upon the Viminal Mount. He kept a public school, taught many who afterwards became great men, and wrote a treatise to confute heresies of all kinds. As the pagans began to treat the Christians with great severity, Justin wrote his first apology in their favour. This piece displays great learning and genius, and occasioned the emperor to publish an edict in favour of the Christians. Soon after, he entered into frequent contests with the Grecians, a person of a vicious life and conversation, but a celebrated cynic philosopher, and his arguments appeared so powerful, yet disgusting to the cynic, that he resolved on, and in the sequel accomplished his destruction. The second apology of Justin, upon certain severities, gave Crescens the cynic an opportunity of prejudicing the emperor against the writer of it, upon which Justin and 6 of his companions were apprehended. Being commanded to sacrifice to the pagan idols, they refused, and were condemned to be scourged and then beheaded, which sentence was executed with all imaginable severity. Several were beheaded for refusing to sacrifice to the image of Jupiter, in particular Concordus, a deacon of the city of Spoleto. Some of the restless northern nations having risen in arms against Rome, the emperor marched to encounter them. He was, however, drawn into an ambush and dreaded the loss of his whole army. Enveloped with mountains, surrounded by enemies, and perishing with thirst, the pagan deities were invoked in vain, when the men belonging to the Milettine or Thundering Legion, who were all Christians, were commanded to call upon their god for succour. A miraculous deliverance immediately ensued. A prodigious quantity of rain fell, which, being caught by the men and filling their dikes, afforded a sudden and astonishing relief. It appears that the storm which miraculously flashed in the faces of the enemy so intimidated them that part deserted to the Roman army, the rest were defeated, and the revolted provinces entirely recovered. This affair occasioned the persecution to subside for some time, at least in those parts, immediately under the inspection of the emperor, but we find that soon it after raged in France, particularly at Lyons, where the tortures to which many of the Christians were put almost exceed the powers of description. The principal of these martyrs were Vettius Agathus, a young man, Blandina, a Christian lady of weak constitution, Sancus, a deacon of Vienna. Red-hot plates of brass were placed upon the tenderest parts of his body. Bilbius, a weak woman, once an apostate. Attalus of Pergamus, and Pothinus, the venerable bishop of Lyons, who was almost 90 years of age. Blandina, on the day when she and 3 other champions were first brought into the amphitheatre, she was suspended on a piece of wood fixed in the ground, and exposed as food for the wild beasts, at which time, by earnest prayers, she encouraged others, but none of the wild beasts would touch her, so that she was remanded to prison. When she was again produced for the 3rd and last time, she was accompanied by Ponticus, a youth of 15, and constancy of their faith so enraged the multitude that neither the sex of one nor the youth of the other were respected, being exposed to all manner of punishments and torture. Being strengthened by Blandina, he preserved unto death. And she, after enduring all torments heretofore mentioned, was at length slain by the sword. When the Christians upon these occasions received martyrdom, they were ornamented and crowned with garlands of flowers, for which they in heaven received eternal crowns of glory. The torments were various, and exclusive of those already mentioned. The martyrs of Lyons were compelled to sit in red-hot iron chairs until their flesh boiled. This was inflicted with particular severity on Sanctus, already mentioned, and some others. Some were sewed up in nets and thrown on the horns of wild bulls, and the carcasses of those who died in prison previous to the appointed time of execution were thrown to the dogs. Indeed, so far did the malice of the pagans proceed, that they set guards over the bodies while the beasts were devouring them, lest the friends of the deceased should get them away by stealth, and the offals left by the dogs were ordered to be burned. The martyrs of Lyons, according to the best accounts we could obtain, who suffered for the gospel, were 48 in number, and their executions happened in the year of Christ, 177. Epipotius and Alexander were celebrated for their great friendship and their Christian union with each other. The first was born at Lyons, the latter at Greece. Epipotius, being compassionated by the governor of Lyons, and exhorted to join the festive pagan worship, replied, "Your pretended tenderness is actually cruelty, and the agreeable life you describe is replete with everlasting death Christ suffered for us, that our pleasures should be immoral, and hath prepared for his followers an eternity of bliss. The frame of a man being composed of two parts, body and soul the first, you mean and perishable, should be rendered subservient to the interests of the last. Your idolatrous feasts may gratify the mortal, but they injure the immortal part, that cannot therefore be enjoying life, which destroys the most valuable moiety of your frame. Your pleasures lead to eternal death, and our pains to perpetual joy." Epipotius was severely beaten, and then put to the rack. Upon being stretched, his flesh was torn with iron hooks. Having borne his torments with incredible patience and unshakable fortitude, he was taken from the rack and beheaded. Valerian and Marcellus, who were nearly related to each other, were imprisoned at Lyons in the year 177 for being Christians. The father was fixed up to the waist in the ground, in which position, after remaining for 3 days, he expired. A.D. 179, Valerian was beheaded. Apollonius, a Roman senator, an accomplished gentleman, a sincere Christian, suffered under Commodus, because he would not worship him as Hercules. Eusebius, Vincentius, Potentiantus, Peregrinus, and Julius, a Roman senator, were martyred on the same account. The fifth persecution, commencing with Severus, A.D. 192. Severus, having been recovered from a severe fit of sickness by a Christian, became a great favourer of the Christians in general. But the prejudice and fury of the ignorant multitude prevailing, obsolete laws were put in execution against the Christians. The progress of Christianity alarmed the pagans, and they revived the stale calumny of placing accidental misfortunes to the account of its professors AD 192. But, though persecuting malice raged, yet the gospel shone with resplendent brightness, and firm as an impregnable rock, withstood the attacks of its boisterous enemies with success. Tertullian, who lived in this age, informs us that if the Christians had collectively withdrawn themselves from the Roman territories, the empire would have been greatly depopulated. Victor, the Bishop of Rome, suffered martyrdom in the first year of the 3rd century, AD 201. Leonidas, the father of the celebrated Origen, was beheaded for being a Christian. Many of Origen's hearers likewise suffered martyrdom, particularly 2 brothers named Plutarchus and Serenus. Another Serenus, Heron, and Heraclides were beheaded. Rheias had boiled pitch poured upon her head, and was then burned, as was Marcella, her mother. Potamiena, the sister of Rheias, was executed in the same manner as Rheias had been. But Basilides, an officer belonging to the army, and ordered her to attend the execution, became her convert. Basilides, being, as an officer, required to take a certain oath, refused, saying that he could not swear by the Roman idols, as he was a Christian. Struck with surprise, the people could not at first believe what they had heard, but he had no sooner confirmed the same than he was dragged before the judge, committed to prison, and afterwards speedily beheaded. Irenaeus, Bishop of Lyon, was born in Greece, and received both a polite and Christian education. It is generally supposed that the account of the persecutions at Lyon was written by himself. He succeeded the martyr Pothinus as the Bishop of Lyon, and ruled his diocese with great propriety. He was a zealous opposer of heresies in general, and about AD 187 he wrote a celebrated tract against heresy. Victor, the Bishop of Rome, wanted to impose the keeping of Easter there, in preference to other places. It occasioned some disorder among the Christians. In particular, Irenaeus wrote him a synodical epistle in the name of the Gallic churches. This zeal in favor of Christianity pointed him out as an object of resentment to the emperor, and in AD 202 he was beheaded. The persecutions now extending to Africa, where many were martyred in that quarter of the globe, the most particular of whom we shall mention. Perpetua, a married lady of about 22 years. Those who suffered with her were Felicitas, a married lady, big with child at her time of being apprehended, and Revocatus, catechumen of Carthage, and a slave. The names of the other prisoners destined to suffer upon this occasion were Saturninus, Secundulus, and Satur. On the day appointed for their execution, they were led to the amphitheatre. Satur, Saturninus, and Revocatus were ordered to run the gauntlet between the hunters, or such as had the care of wild beasts. The hunters being drawn up in 2 ranks, they ran between, and were severely lashed as they passed. Felicitas and Perpetua were stripped, in order to be thrown to a mad bull, which made his first attack upon Perpetua and stunned her, and then darted at Felicitas and gored her dreadfully, but not killing them. The executioner did that office with a sword. Revocatus and Satur were destroyed by wild beasts. Saturninus was beheaded, and Secundulus died in prison. These executions were in the year 205, on the 8th day of March. Spiratus and 12 others were likewise beheaded, as was Andocles in France. Asclepiades, bishop of Antioch, suffered many tortures, but his life was spared. Cecilia, a young lady of a good family in Rome, was married to a gentleman named Valerian. She converted her husband and brother, who were beheaded, and the Maximus, or officer, who led them to execution, becoming their convert, suffered the same fate. The lady was placed naked into a scalding bath, and having continued there a considerable time, her head was struck off with a sword. A.D. 222. Callistus, bishop of Rome, was martyred. A.D. 224, but the manner of his death is not recorded, and Urban, the bishop of Rome, met the same fate in A.D. 232. The sixth persecution, under Maximinus, A.D. 235. A.D. 235 was in the time of Maximinus. In Cappadocia, the president Seremianus did all he could to exterminate the Christians from that province. The principal Persians who perished under his reign were Pontianus, the bishop of Rome, Anderos, a Grecian, his successor, who gave offense to the government by collecting the acts of the martyrs Pamachius and Quirtius, Roman senators, with all their family and many other Christians. Simplicius, senator, Calepodonius, a Christian minister, thrown into the Tiber. Martina, a noble and beautiful virgin, and Hippolytus, a Christian prelate, tied to a wild horse and dragged until he expired. During this persecution, raised by Maximinus, numberless Christians were slain without trial and buried indiscriminately in heaps, sometimes 50 or 60 being cast into a pit together, without the least bit of decency. The tyrant, Maximinus, dying A.D. 238, was succeeded by Gordian, during whose great reign, and that of his successor Philip, the church was free from persecution for the space of more than 10 years. But A.D. 249, a violent persecution broke out in Alexandria, at the instigation of a pagan priest, without the knowledge of the emperor. The seventh persecution, under Decius, A.D. 249. This was occasioned partly by the hatred he bore to his predecessor Philip, who was deemed a Christian, and partly to his jealousy concerning the amazing increase of Christianity, for the heathen temples began to be forsaken, and the Christian churches thronged. These reasons stimulated Decius to attempt the very extirpation of the name of Christian, and it was unfortunate for the gospel that many errors had about this time crept into the church. The Christians were at variance with each other. Self-interest divided those whom social love ought to have united, and the virulence of pride occasioned a variety of factions. The heathens in general were ambitious to enforce the imperial decrees upon this occasion, and looked upon the murder of a Christian as a merit to themselves. The martyrs upon this occasion were innumerable, but the principal we shall give some account of. Fabian, the Bishop of Rome, was the first person of eminence who felt the severity of this persecution. The deceased Emperor Philip had, on account of his integrity, committed his treasure to the care of this good man. But Decius, not finding as much as avarice made him expect, determined to wreak his vengeance on the good prelate. He was accordingly seized, and on the 20th of January, A.D. 50, he suffered decapitation. Julian, a native of Cilicia, as we are informed by Saint Chrysostom, was seized upon for being a Christian. He was put into a leather bag, together with a number of serpents and scorpions, and in that condition thrown into the sea. Peter, a young man, amiable for superior qualities of his body and mind, was beheaded for refusing to sacrifice to Venus. He had said, "I am astonished you should sacrifice to such an infamous woman, whose debaucheries even your own histories record, and whose life consisted of such actions your laws would punish. No, I shall offer to the true God the acceptable sacrifice of praises and prayers." Optimus, the proconsul of Asia, upon hearing this, ordered the prisoner to be stretched upon a wheel, by which all of his bones were broken, and then he was sent to be beheaded. Nicomachus, being brought before the proconsul as a Christian, was ordered to sacrifice to the pagan idols. He replied, "I cannot pay that respect to devils, which is only due to the Almighty." This speech so much enraged the proconsul that Nicomachus was put to the rack. After enduring the torments for a time, he recanted, but scarcely had he given proof of his frailty than he fell into the greatest agonies, dropped down on the ground, and expired immediately. Denisa, a young woman of only 16 years of age, who beheld this terrible judgment, suddenly exclaimed, "O unhappy wretch! Why would you buy a moment's ease at the expense of a miserable eternity?" Optimus, hearing this, called to her, and Denisa avowing herself to be a Christian, she was beheaded by his order soon after. Andrew and Paul, two companions of Nicomachus the martyr, A.D. 251, suffered martyrdom by stoning and expired, calling on their blessed Redeemer. Alexander and Epimachus of Alexandria were apprehended for being Christians, and, confessing the accusation, were beat with staves torn with hooks, and at length burnt in the fire, and we are informed, in a fragment preserved by Eusebius, that 4 female martyrs suffered on the same day, and at the same place, but not in the same manner, for these were beheaded. Lucian and Marcian, 2 wicked pagans, though skillful magicians, becoming converts to Christianity to make amends for their former errors, lived the lives of hermits, and subsisted upon bread and water only. After some time spent in this manner, they became zealous preachers, and had many converts. The persecution, however, raging at this time, they were seized upon and carried before Sabinus, the governor of Bithynia. On being asked by what authority they took upon themselves to preach, Lucian answered, "That the laws of charity and humanity obliged all men to endeavor the conversion of their neighbors, and to do everything in their power to rescue them from the snares of the devil. Lucian, having answered in this manner, Marcion said that then conversion was by the same grace which was given to St. Paul, who, from a zealous persecutor of the church, became a preacher of the gospel. The proconsul, finding that he could not prevail with them to renounce their faith, condemned them to be burned alive, which sentence was soon after executed. Trypho and Respicius, two eminent men, were seized as Christians and imprisoned at Nice. Their feet were pierced with nails. They were dragged through the streets, scourged, torn with iron hooks, scorched with light torches, and at length beheaded, February the 1st, A.D. 251. Agatha, a Sicilian lady, was not more remarkable for her personal and acquired endowments than her piety. Her beauty was such that Quintian, the governor of Sicily, became enamored of her, and made many attempts upon her chastity, without success. In order to gratify his passions with the greater conveniency, he put the virtuous lady into the hands of Aphrodita, a very infamous and licentious woman. This wretch tried every artifice to win her to the desired prostitution, but found all of her efforts were vain, for her chastity was impregnable, and she well knew that virtue alone could procure true happiness. Aphrodita acquainted Quintian with the inefficiency of her endeavors, who, enraged to be foiled in his designs, changed his lust into resentment. On her confessing that she was a Christian, he determined to gratify his revenge, as he could not his passion. Pursuant to his orders, she was scourged, burned with red-hot irons, and torn up with sharp hooks. Having borne these torments with admirable fortitude, she was next laid naked upon live coals, intermingled with glass, and then, being carried back to prison, she there expired on the 5th of February, 251. Cyril, Bishop of Gortyna, was seized by order of Lucius, the governor of that place, who nevertheless exhorted him to obey the imperial mandate, perform the sacrifices, and save his venerable person from destruction, for he was now 84 years of age. The good prelate replied that as he had long taught others to save their souls, he should only think now of his own salvation. The worthy prelate heard his fiery sentence without emotion, walked cheerfully to the place of execution, and underwent his martyrdom with great fortitude. The persecution raged in no place more than in the island of Crete, for the governor, being exceedingly active in executing the imperial decrees, that place streamed with pious blood. Babylas, a Christian of liberal education, became Bishop of Antioch, A.D. 237, on the demise of Zebinus. He acted with inimitable zeal, and governed the church with admirable prudence during his most tempestuous times. The first misfortune that happened to Antioch during his mission was the siege of it by Sapor, the king of Persia, who, having overrun all Syria, took and plundered this city among others, and used the Christian inhabitants with greater severity than the rest, but was soon totally defeated by Gordian. After Gordian's death, in the reign of Decius, that emperor came to Antioch, where, having a desire to visit an assembly of Christians, Babylas opposed him, and absolutely refused to let him come in. The emperor dissembled his anger at that time, but soon sending for the bishop, he sharply reproved him for his insolence, and then ordered him to sacrifice to the pagan deities as an expiation for his offense. This being refused, he was committed to prison, loaded with chains, and treated with great severities, and then beheaded, together with 3 young men who had been his pupils, AD 251. Alexander, Bishop of Jerusalem, about this time was cast into prison on account of his religion, where he died through severity of his confinement. Julianus, an old man lame with the gout, and Cronion, another Christian, were bound on the backs of camels, severely scourged, and then thrown into a fire and consumed. Also, 40 virgins at Antioch, after being imprisoned and scourged, were burned. In the year of our Lord, 251 AD, the Emperor Decius, having erected a pagan temple at Ephesus, he commanded all who were in that city to sacrifice to the idols. The order was nobly refused by 7 of his own soldiers, Maximianus, Martianus, Joannes, Malchus, Dionysius, Serapion, and Constantinus. The emperor, wishing to win these soldiers to renounce their faith by entreaties and leniency, gave them considerable respite till he returned from an expedition. During the emperor's absence, they escaped and hid themselves in a cavern, which the emperor being informed of at his return, the mouth of the cave was closed up, and they all perished of hunger. Theodora, a beautiful young lady of Antioch, on refusing to sacrifice to the Roman idols, was condemned to the stews, that her virtue may be sacrificed to the brutality of lust. Didymus, a Christian, disguised himself in the habit of a Roman soldier, went to the house, informed Theodora who he was, and advised her to make her escape wearing his clothes. This being effected, and a man found in the brothel instead of a beautiful lady, Didymus was taken before the president, to whom, confessing the truth and owning that he was a Christian, the sentence of death was immediately pronounced upon him. Theodora, hearing that her deliverer was likely to suffer, came to the judge, threw herself at his feet, and begged that the sentence might fall upon her as the guilty person. But, deaf to the cries of the innocent, and insensible to the calls of justice, the inflexible judge condemned both, when they were executed accordingly, being first beheaded, and their bodies afterwards burned. Secundianus, having been accused as a Christian, was conveyed to prison by some soldiers. On the way, Varianus and Marcellinus said, "Where are you carrying the innocent?" This interrogatory occasioned them to be seized, and all 3, after having been tortured, were hanged and decapitated. Origen, the celebrated presbyter and catechist of Alexandria, at the age of 64 was seized and thrown into a loathsome prison laden with fetters, his feet placed in the stocks and his legs extended to the utmost for several successive days. He was threatened with fire and tormented by every lingering means the most infernal imaginations could suggest. During this cruel temporizing, the Emperor Decius died, and Gallus, who succeeded him, engaging in a war with the Goths, the Christians met with a respite. In this interim, Origen obtained his enlargement, and, retiring to Tyre, he there remained until his death, which happened when he was in the 69th year of his life. Gallus, the emperor, having concluded his wars, a plague broke out in the empire. Sacrifices to the pagan deities were ordered by the emperor, and persecutions spread from the interior to the extreme parts of the empire. And many fell martyrs to the impetuosity of the rabble, as well as the prejudice of the magistrates. Among these were Cornelius, the Christian bishop of Rome, and Lucius, his successor in 253. Most of the errors which crept into the church at this time arose from placing human reason in the competition with revelation, but the fallacy of such arguments being proved by the most able divines, the opinions they had created vanished away, like the stars before the sun. Well, we will continue this in part 2 tomorrow. But first let me thank my patrons and supporters: Dark, Carrie, Kimberly, Ember, Ben, Britt, Charles, Aaron, James, Jeffrey, Melissa, Scott, Stark Factory, Wendy, Jaden, Sherry, Jessica, Christine, and Sally. Thank you very much. Well, I hope you enjoyed it, as grim as it was. We will continue tomorrow, as there's plenty more to talk about. A reminder, this work is taken from John Foxe's Book of Martyrs. I will leave a description to this public domain work leave a link in the description. Thank you very much. Lots of love to you all. I'll see you tomorrow.